Hey everybody, today we're talking about a sport that I've been getting into a lot more recently, and that is wrestling. Not that kind of wrestling. Closer, but not quite. Now I'm talking about amateur competitive wrestling that you see from grade school all the way up to Olympics. And I've been getting into it more recently because our own son, our youngest son, has gotten into it and he's participating in the school sport. So today I'm going to talk about gear and settings and positioning. And I'm also going to talk about some special circumstances you might encounter when you go to a wrestling meet. All right, let's get going on gear. So when it comes to gear, my advice is pretty simple and straightforward. You need a camera that's capable of hitting ISOs in the 8,000 to 10,000 range because you're going to be in gyms that are pretty dark. And when it comes to lenses, really, if you got a full frame camera, we're talking 70 to 200 f2.8. This will cover just about everything you need to do when it comes to wrestling because you can get pretty close to the action. If you're on a crop frame camera, you're looking at somewhere in the 45 to 135 range, which is the equivalent. It's important that it's f2.8 because of the bad lighting, but other than that, if you got something like this, you're golden. Now, there may be some special circumstances, which I'll talk about later when it comes to lighting, but I'll get into that in a few minutes. All right, so now that we've talked about equipment, let's talk about what kind of settings we're going to put on those lenses and cameras. First of all, I would tell you that wrestling can be a very slow sport at times, so you might be tempted to go down to a 500th of a second, even 250th of a second, because sometimes they're just locked up and they're barely moving. However, there's also times when, and it moves very quickly, they're moving very rapidly, picking the other person up, throwing them down, and do some quick maneuvers. So for that reason, I like to stick with 1/1000th of a second. So that is what I recommend, 1/1000th of a second for your shutter speed. You can get away with something a little slower, say down to 1/500th of a second if it's a particularly dark venue, but I don't recommend it unless you really have to. As far as aperture, I would say go as wide open as you possibly can. Most lenses are around the f2.8 range, so that's what I would say. But basically what it comes down to is the widest your lens will go open. Again, I'm assuming pretty dark venues here, and that you're using the ambient light. As far as ISO, it's really going to vary based on the ambient light and those other two settings that you just made. So when I go into a venue, I'll set the 1/1000th of a second. I'll open up my aperture to f2.8. I'll either guesstimate what the ISO should be and take a shot and see what happens, or I'll use auto ISO, let it make a decision, see what the camera decided on, take a shot with that, and then adjust from there. So it's pretty easy. So I always set manually shutter, aperture, and then I figure out what the ISO and set that manually. Generally, the ISO doesn't vary, except in some special circumstances where I'm going to get to the end. So hang around for that because I'm going to have to go into that in a little more detail. Now, as far as the other settings like white balance, I generally start off using auto white balance. It generally works. Most settings I go into, most venues, auto white balance just works just fine. Now, you might have to adjust your white balance, and I've got a video right here that explains 3 different ways to do it. But if you take a shot with auto white balance, it works fine. Go with it. And then finally, I really recommend something called anti-flicker. Some people advocate against it. I generally always advocate for it. And the reason being is you may not be able to see it, but your camera can see variations in the power output coming from the lights. They tend to cycle. And what happens is if you're taking continuous frames and continuous shots, one frame may be perfectly fine. The next frame may be a stop under or 2 stops under, and the white balance may be completely thrown off. That's what this anti-flicker is for. So if your camera has it, put it on, leave it on. All right, so now that we talked about some gear and settings, let's talk about where you want to position yourself to get the best shots possible. Well, let's go. So we can actually determine where to position ourselves for a wrestling match, we need to talk about how these wrestling matches are set up. What you see before you here is a typical setup for a wrestling mat. Basically, it's a large, like 25-foot, don't quote me on that, 25-foot mat. There's some rings in this, there's an outer ring and an inner ring, and then there's this little rectangle here in the center, and I'll get to that in a second. The other thing they have is there is a scorer's table right here. Now, depending on the match, the meet, how it's set up, you will see a variety of different arrangements when it comes to team seating and with where the audience goes. So, typical setup. What happens at these matches is they'll start both standing up on either side of this rectangle here in the center. Referee will start them and they'll get going. They have to stay within this circle right here, this outer circle. If they go outside of the circle, then the referee stops them, brings them back to the center, and there's some procedures involved with that. Each match is 3 minutes long. If a person is not pinned first. Sometimes those pins happen very, very quickly. We have one wrestler who's far more dominant than the other, it could be over within 15 seconds and the match is over and you're done. So now for small matches where there's only like 2 teams competing against each other, you'll have seating on either side of this single setup right here. I've also seen other meets and matches where they've got multiple mats going on at the same time. For example, like this. In this case, we have 2 side by side. Scorers tables are still at this back end. And then the seating for the teams is on either side. And usually the audience is over on this side. I've also seen it where there are multiple mats, not just 2, but 3, 4, 5, even 6. So you can see with a setup like this is a lot going on. So where do you position yourself to photograph something like this? Well, let's go back to that single mat and we'll talk about that. So back to the single mat. Usually the audience is over here. Of course, we got the judges table right here. Now there's a couple things that happens. When there's a break in the action, what'll happen is the referee will bring the wrestlers together in what they call the referee's position. And what'll happen is one of 2 things. One of the wrestlers will be down on all fours with the other one behind them in a superior position. And then when the referee says go or starts them, the person who's down all 4 will try to break away. The person who's in the superior position will try to pin the opponent. The other thing that could happen is both wrestlers will stay upright and just start wrestling from a standing position. When they're in the referee's position where one person is down on all 4s, hands and knees, they're pointing in this direction toward the audience. That would lend you to want to set up on this side, right? Somewhere over here so you can get those kind of photos. Here comes the problem. When the match is over, whoever won, the referee by standard will want to raise their arm up going in this direction toward the scorer's table. So that doesn't help if you're sitting over here and you want to catch that photo of the referee raising up the winner's hand, right? So the technique I came up with is I talk to the referee ahead of time. I'll say, hey, this is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to take some photos. I know in the referee position, they're going to be facing this way, but when you raise their hand, you normally do it this way. That's the standard. Can you help me out and do it in the same direction? Every time I have asked, the referees have agreed to do it because they know you're there for photos. Potentially these people are going to buy these photos and the referees don't really care either way. So with having said all that, usually I'll sit somewhere right in here to catch both the referee position where they're pointed in this direction, you get those faces, and assuming you've talked to the referee, get the outstretched hand of or upraised hand of the person who won the match. And you get those types of photos. Now, let's talk about configurations where there are multiple mats. Okay, I've also been to meets where there are 2 mats going at the same time. This is how I normally do it. Again, using the same basic principles I just outlined. Basically what I'll do is I'll park myself right here. Here's the audience. Park myself right here and I'll go in this direction, right? So you can get the faces, and if you've talked to the referees, you'll get the raised hands when they actually win the meet. All right, now that we've got some basic setup for how these matches and meets go, let's talk about some special situations. So I may mention a couple times that there's some special situations you might have to deal with as you're photographing wrestling events. The first one I want to talk about is the color of the mats. Now, when they're wrestling, they tend to have their faces down toward the mats quite a bit. If you've got a mat that's black, gray, light gray, that's usually not a problem. So those are neutral colors. And although the black doesn't give much reflection, you're gonna have to deal with shadows, at least it's a neutral color. What you're gonna run into, however, is whatever school is hosting the event, you can have a wide variety of colors. You can have reds and greens and blues and stuff like that. And those create a cast that goes up into their face. And it's very difficult to try to deal with the white balance when you got that kind of situation. You may have perfectly good white balance for the rest of the scene, but their face has taken on, or their lower bodies have taken on some sort of weird color cast. And there's always so much you can do about that kind of situation. If you're great in Photoshop or other software like that, you may be able to manipulate it and fix that and mask out those areas and change the colors. For the most part, my technique is to just avoid taking any photos when their faces are down toward whatever this colored mat is. Wait till their faces are up and take those kind of shots. You may have to pick and choose, you may have to cull a lot of photos, but to me, that's probably the best solution. You know, another solution for dark gyms and perhaps for this colored mat issue is you can take on-camera flash photos. I'm not a big advocate. I don't think that looks particularly good. I don't like to do it because you got deep shadows behind them, but it is a technique. People have done it before, and if that's what you need to do to get decent photos for a wrestling meet, then that's what you got to do. So I suggest if you experiment a little with it, try some flash photos and see how it works out for it. Now you might want to talk to the coaches involved, talk to the referees involved, make sure they're okay with it. But in general, most people don't even notice that the flash is going off when they're actually wrestling. Now there's one more special situation that I have not personally encountered because it is so rare where I live. But it has happened in the past. And in fact, I actually had to call a photographer friend of mine who has encountered this and see how he handles those situations. And the situation I'm talking about is the overhead light where all the lights in the gymnasium have been turned off and all they've got is like an overhead light down onto the mat itself. So all you got is this cone of light coming down. Everything is black except for that cone of light. Here's an example right here from my friend. Now in these spotlight situations, I think the best suggestion I could give you based on what I've been told by others is, you know, you want to expose for the highlights what people normally see. You don't want to expose for the darkness or the shadows. People don't normally see things that way. Make your pictures the way people normally see in this kind of situation. So expose for the highlights. You might want to use auto ISO because the problem is the light may be very intense here in the very center and then it drops off to the edges. And guess what? In wrestling, they move around. They're not always in the center. So you might want to try auto ISO in those cases, exposing for the highlights. Another option for the mat situation and the spotlight situation is to use off-camera radio-controlled lights. So here's an illustration right here. Basically, you've got your mat and you've got the light set up at 45-degree angles pointed in toward the mat, set off by a remote control unit mounted to your camera. Obviously, this is a little more sophisticated. Not everybody's going to have this kind of equipment to do it, but it is an option if you want to try it out and you've got the wherewithal to do so to take care of these kind of situations with the spotlights and the mat issues. All right, everybody, thanks for stopping by and checking out this video. I do appreciate it. If you liked what you saw, make sure you hit that like button. If you're not already a subscriber, you might want to consider hitting that subscribe button and the notification bell. While you're here, I got some good videos at the end that are great follow-ups to this particular video. Check those out. All right, guys, I will see you next time.